November 14, 1942, Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal, 22:52 hours. A low moon hung over the water like a dying lantern. The sea was black, glassy, and deceptively calm, the kind of calm that precedes a storm you can't see, only feel in your bones. Aboard USS Washington, BB-56, the bridge was silent except for the steady hum of the ship's massive turbines deep below the waterline. The steel deck vibrated beneath the boots of sailors as they moved with controlled urgency. Their voices hushed, their shadows stretched long under red combat lighting. Rear Admiral Willis, Ching, Lee, tall, broad-shouldered, pipe clenched between his teeth, stepped forward toward the rail of the open bridge. The humid Pacific air clung to his khaki uniform. Below him, Washington's 16-inch, 45 caliber Mark VI guns, 9 of the most destructive weapons afloat, loomed in the darkness like giants waiting for their cue. Lee exhaled slowly. The pipe glowed faintly. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Japanese are coming, and tonight, we'll be the ones in the dark who can see." Behind him stood Captain Glenn Davis, Washington's commanding officer, his hands wrapped around binoculars despite knowing he wouldn't spot anything with them. Not tonight, not in this pitch-black void. What mattered now wasn't eyesight. It was radar. 22:55 hours, Combat Information Center, CIC. Deep inside the ship, tucked behind armored bulkheads, a team of sailors hovered over glowing oscilloscope screens. The steady ping, ping, ping of the SG radar echoed through the compartment, a sound no other battleship in the Pacific possessed with such clarity and range. "Contact bearing 042, range 18,000 yards. A young radar operator called out, voice controlled but trembling with adrenaline. Another operator leaned in, brow furrowed. "Multiple returns, looks like a formation. Big ones." Lieutenant Commander Ed Hooper, Washington's gunnery officer, turned sharply. "How big?" "Battleship size, sir." Hooper felt a chill. "Kirishima," he murmured. A Japanese battle group was steaming straight at them, and at Henderson Field. The airstrip the Marines had fought for tooth and nail. If the Japanese reached it before sunrise, they would shell it to rubble and strangle the Guadalcanal campaign in its cradle. Hooper lifted his phone, his voice tightening. "Bridge, CIC, enemy battleship confirmed. Heading straight for us. 23:03 hours, the shadow of defeat." Above, on the darkened bridge, Admiral Lee nodded slowly as the report came through. He tapped his pipe against the railing. "Just as we expected," he said quietly. Captain Davis stepped closer. "Sir, Indiana is still picking up scattered returns. Her radar's struggling. We're the only ship that can see the whole picture." Lee smiled faintly. "Good, then we'll do it ourselves." Only hours before, an entire American cruiser-destroyer group, the men who had bled in the first night of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, had been obliterated by Japanese firepower. The waters beneath Washington were still littered with oil slicks, broken hulls, and drifting lifeboats. The sound people heard when they leaned over the rail wasn't the wind. It was the faint crackling of fires still burning on drowned ships below. And now a Japanese force was coming again, including the battleship Kirishima, survivor of Pearl Harbor's raid and veteran of dozens of bombardments. But standing on Washington's bridge, Admiral Lee showed no fear. This was the moment he had trained for, since before the war. Before radar became real, before anyone believed battles could be fought in complete darkness. Lee had believed. Now the Pacific was giving him the chance to prove it. 23:12 hours, Washington goes to battle stations. A klaxon burst across the ship. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations." Boots thundered across steel decks. Watertight doors clanged shut. Men slid into cramped gun turrets. Fingered firing keys, adjusted elevation wheels. Inside turret 2, a gun captain muttered to his crew. "Tonight we make history, boys, or we join the others down below." In the plotting room, sailors began cranking range dials and talking firing solutions into analog computers the size of refrigerators. Sweat dripped onto brass gears as they worked. The air tasted like oil, metal, and fear. 23:18 hours, contact. Enemy cruiser formation now at 14,000 yards. Multiple destroyers screening ahead. CIC's voice crackled through the bridge speakers. Captain Davis turned to Admiral Lee. "We'll be inside visual range within minutes. Should we hold fire until we have a confirmed silhouette?" Lee didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "We see them. They don't see us. That's the point." He stepped toward the intercom. Pipe smoke drifting around his head. "Hooper, prepare to engage with radar-controlled main battery. Priority target, enemy battleship." "Aye, sir," Hooper replied, firing solution loading. Lee's blue eyes hardened. "Let's show 'em what American radar can do." 23:24 hours, radar paints a battleship. Hooper watched the SG radar screen sweep again. A large, unmistakable echo pulsed near the center. "There she is, Kirishima," he said softly. The operator beside him whispered, "She doesn't even know we're here." Hooper lifted the firing key. "Bridge, target locked, stable track, ready when you are." 23:29 hours, the first shots. Davis looked at Lee. Lee nodded once. "Open fire." The order traveled through the ship like a lightning strike. Inside turret 1, 3 16-inch guns elevated with a low mechanical groan. Powder bags slid into place. Steel shells weighing 2.700 pounds each were rammed home. The turret captain shouted, "Stand by." A heartbeat. Then, BOOM. Washington's main battery erupted, the recoil shaking the entire ship. A blinding flash lit the ocean. Shockwaves rolled across the water like ripples from an earthquake. Shells screamed into the night, invisible to the eye but unerring on radar. 20 seconds later, 3 massive geysers of flame erupted around Kirishima. One shell slammed into her starboard side, another tore through her steering rooms, a third smashed into her forward magazines. Japanese sailors screamed as compartments flooded and bulkheads collapsed. The battle had begun, and Washington had landed the first punch. 23:33 hours, Kirishima fires back. A lookout shouted from Washington's starboard wing. Enemy muzzle flashes, starboard. Battleship firing. Distant orange blossoms flickered across the black horizon as Kirishima answered with her 14-inch guns. Her shells fell short, hundreds of yards off. Washington had already changed course. Her radar told her where to be. Kirishima fired again. Again she missed. Washington was dancing in the dark, and the Japanese were swinging blind. 23:38 hours, hit her again. In CIC, Hooper barked. Range 12,000, target turning circles, she's lost steering. Fire for effect, Lee ordered. Washington unleashed a second full salvo. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each one hit home. Kirishima tried to run, tried to fight, tried to regain bearings, but Washington was tracking her as if she were glowing in daylight. One Japanese captain screamed into the voice tube. "Washington is a ghost, we cannot see her." 23:45 hours, a battleship dies. Kirishima listed sharply to starboard. Fires roared on her decks. Her rudder was jammed, water poured into her boiler rooms. Ammunition cooked off in bright, stuttering detonations. Her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. In her final minutes, she rolled slowly onto her side, her pagoda mast glowing red-hot, before sinking into Iron Bottom Sound, where dozens of Japanese and American ships already slept. She was the last battleship ever sunk in a surface duel by another battleship. Washington had done it in less than 15 minutes. 23:50 hours, 0 casualties. Washington slowed to 10 knots. Damage control reported. No hits, no casualties, all systems operational. Admiral Lee removed his pipe and looked at Captain Davis. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of history. "Captain," he said softly, "tonight belongs to your men." Washington had fought alone. Had sunk a capital ship alone. Had saved Guadalcanal alone. And had done it without losing a single sailor. As the ship turned eastward into the darkness, Iron Bottom Sound lay still once more, but the war had just changed forever. Radar had proven itself. And Washington had shown the world what the future of naval warfare looked like. May 2, 1942, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, Bremerton, Washington, 7:40 hours. Cold morning mist drifted over the harbor as the battleship USS Washington, BB-56, towered above the pier. Her hull freshly painted, her superstructure gleaming silver-gray beneath the rising sun. Welders sparked along her deck edges. Riggers called to one another from cranes. And the low rumble of engines testing deep in her armored belly resonated like the heartbeat of a giant awakening. Below the gangway, a group of new sailors gathered in awe. Few had ever seen a battleship up close. "She's a monster," one whispered. "No," said Chief Boatswain's mate Larry Duvall, eyes narrowed with pride. "She's a boxer, tough, fast, and mean, and she ain't even shown the world her punch yet." He was right. Washington, a North Carolina-class battleship, was unlike anything afloat in the Pacific. Fully modernized with Mark 8 radar, state-of-the-art fire control gear, and a crew drilled relentlessly in night fighting. She represented a new vision of naval warfare, though most of the Navy didn't realize it yet. Up on the foredeck, a tall man with a square jaw and pipe clamped between his teeth walked slowly along the teak planks. Hands behind his back. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee. He paused beside the massive forward turret. Crew members snapped to attention, but Lee only nodded. "You'll find out soon enough," he said quietly, "that the Navy teaches one way to fight. Radar teaches another." His gaze drifted out over the fog-cloaked Sound, toward the future battles only he could see coming. June 1942, Battles of the Old Guard. The months following Pearl Harbor had rocked the U.S. Navy. Old battleships lay wrecked in the mud of Oahu. Cruisers had fallen in the Java Sea. Destroyers bled themselves dry in night battles nobody was prepared for. And through it all, one truth echoed across the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night. Their battleships and cruisers, equipped with superb optics and veterans of decades of night training, had torn through Allied forces from Savo Island to Tassafaronga. American officers whispered it in wardrooms. "We can't see them. We can't hit them. We can't fight them after sunset." Admiral Lee had listened to every report, and quietly disagreed. "We can see them," he told Captain Glenn Davis one evening aboard Washington, "but only if we trust the new eyes we've been given." He tapped the radar scope. Machines don't blink. August 1942, Guadalcanal, a new kind of hell. On the other side of the Pacific, the 1st Marines stormed ashore onto Guadalcanal, capturing an unfinished Japanese airstrip the enemy had been preparing for months. They renamed it Henderson Field. And the Japanese wanted it back, at any cost. Night after night, battleships and cruisers of the Tokyo Express roared down the slot, turning the newly won airfield into a cratered wasteland. Washington steamed south with Task Force 64. Captain Davis stood beside Lee on the starboard wing of the bridge, scanning the violet horizon as clouds rolled low over the sea. One day, Davis muttered, "We'll have to face their big guns." Lee nodded slowly. "And when we do," he said, tapping the metal railing, "we'll be ready. They won't be." September 1942, the test. Inside Washington's Combat Information Center, sailors crowded around radar screens. The room hummed with electricity and tension. Lee had ordered a full-scale night gunnery trial using only radar bearings, no optics. A target barge was towed 15 miles out. Lee folded his arms. "Sink it." Hooper, the gunnery officer, lifted the firing key. "All turrets, fire." The ship shook violently as the main battery roared. Seconds later, spotters on the fantail shouted, "Direct hit, first salvo." Another hit, and another. The target barge disintegrated. Lee lit his pipe and exhaled. "There," he said, "proof." But back in Pearl Harbor, senior officers were unimpressed. Radars untested. Optics win battles. No captain should fire blind. Lee remained silent. But the frustration in his eyes was unmistakable. October 1942, First Blood. Washington escorted convoys near the Santa Cruz Islands when the radio crackled. Enemy carriers, inbound. Shells thundered, bombers screamed from the sky, and Washington's anti-aircraft guns filled the air with steel. Smoke and fire streaked the horizon as the battle raged. When it was over, USS Enterprise damaged. USS Hornet sunk. Several destroyers lost. Washington? Barely a scratch. Her crew whispered a phrase quietly that night in the mess decks. "This ship, she's lucky." But Admiral Lee corrected them gently. "Luck favors the trained." November 1942, the call. On the evening of November 12, messages raced across Navy channels. Henderson Field attacked. Cactus Air Force crippled. Japanese bombardment group inbound. Washington was ordered south, fast. On the bridge, Captain Davis studied the order. "They're sending us alone?" "Not alone," Lee said. "We have Indiana, and radar. But the Japanese outnumber us." Lee bit down on his pipe. "They won't see us. And if they do, they won't live long enough to matter." He turned toward the towering darkness ahead. Iron Bottom Sound was waiting. And so was history. November 14, 1942, 1945 hours, 30 miles north of Guadalcanal. Rain clouds gathered over the Pacific in jagged, uneven layers, illuminated only when distant lightning spidered across the sky. The sea rolled with a slow, heavy motion, as if preparing itself for the violence it knew was coming. Aboard USS Washington, the mood had shifted. No more jokes. No more chatter. Only quiet concentration. Men checked ammunition hoists, tightened turret braces, secured watertight doors, and whispered last-minute corrections into sound-powered phones. In the glow of red battle lamps, Admiral Willis lowered his binoculars. He hadn't seen anything for hours, not with his eyes, but his radar operators had been painting the sea with electronic pulses since sunset. "Contact in 2 hours," Lee murmured. Captain Glenn Davis nodded, assuming they follow pattern. "They will," Lee said. "The Tokyo Express always arrives at night." He tapped his pipe against the steel railing. "But tonight, we're the ones waiting in the dark." 21:14 hours, Combat Information Center, CIC. The heart of Washington pulsed with dim green light. Radar screens glowed like ghostly moons in the hands of sailors barely out of their teens. Sweat dripped down their faces despite the cold from the ventilators. "Surface contact. Bearing 146, range 34,000 yards," the operator announced. Another radar tech leaned forward, adjusting the dial. Getting multiple returns, destroyer screen in front, heavy returns behind them. Hooper, the gunnery officer, stiffened. "That'll be Kirishima's group." He lifted the handset. "Bridge, radar confirms battleship-size contact." 22:02 hours, Shadow Fleet. The Japanese column steamed southward at high speed, slicing the black water like a spear tip. In the moonless dark, their lookouts saw nothing but empty horizon. Aboard the battleship Kirishima, Captain Iwabuchi peered across the waves, frowning. "American ships?" "Not visible, sir," a lookout replied. "Good," Iwabuchi muttered, "then tonight belongs to us." It didn't. Up on Washington's bridge, Lee leaned toward Davis. "They can't see us. They think they're alone. That's how this must go." 22:27 hours, the trap tightens. Washington and USS South Dakota now moved in formation, two massive silhouettes hidden in perfect blackness. But only Washington had functioning radar. Lee knew it. Davis knew it. Hooper knew it. The entire battle would fall on Washington's shoulders. "South Dakota is losing her radar," a radioman shouted suddenly. "Electrical issues on multiple decks." Davis cursed under his breath. "That leaves us blind on one flank." Lee shook his head. "That leaves them blind. We're still seeing everything." He stepped toward the intercom. "All hands, stand by for engagement. Maintain silence." 23:09 hours, the battle begins elsewhere. The first American destroyers ahead of Washington made contact with the Japanese vanguard, and paid for it in blood. Flashes erupted miles ahead as destroyers Walk, Preston, and Benham were blasted apart by Japanese guns. The bridge of Washington shook slightly as distant shockwaves rolled across the water. A young sailor swallowed hard. "God, they're killing everyone up there." Lee didn't look away from the radar repeater. "That's why we're here," he said softly. 23:17 hours, South Dakota fades into darkness. Suddenly, Washington's radio crackled with a frantic call from USS South Dakota, BB-57. "We are losing power, taking fire from multiple bearings, electrical failure." "Static." Davis turned sharply. "She's blind." South Dakota, a massive battleship, drifted into the battlefield like a wounded animal, lit up by Japanese searchlights. Hammered by cruiser salvos. "Can we support her?" Davis demanded. "Not yet," Lee said sharply. "If we reveal ourselves now, we lose the advantage. The mission is Henderson Field, not a gunnery duel." He inhaled deeply from his pipe. "We wait." 23:22 hours, Washington alone. The Japanese fleet surged forward, converging on South Dakota like sharks. Kirishima's guns boomed across the sea. Washington still held fire. The men inside her armored citadel waited, muscles taut, breaths shallow. One gunner whispered into the dark. "Why aren't we shooting?" His chief replied. "Because Admiral Lee sees more than we do." 23:26 hours, the moment arrives. CIC suddenly erupted with noise. Large return braking formation, bearing 044. Battleship turning toward us. Hooper grabbed the phone. "Bridge, Kirishima is committing. She's coming for us." Lee exhaled, calm as stone. "Captain Davis, turn Washington toward the enemy." Davis nodded. "Ahead full, bring us to 044. The battleship leaned into her turn, her bow slicing through black water. She was no longer hiding. She was hunting. 23:29 hours, open fire. Davis turned to Lee. "Sir?" Lee nodded once. "Fire." The word echoed through every steel corridor, every turret room, every powder magazine. Aboard Washington, the machinery of destruction came alive. Turrets groaned. Shells locked into breeches. Powder bags slid into place. Firing circuits engaged. Then, boom! Washington's first salvo split the night in two. A second salvo followed. Then a third. Shells arced invisibly through the dark sky. Seconds later, a distant explosion lit the horizon. Kirishima had been hit hard, and Washington kept firing. 23:32 hours, Kirishima in crisis. On the Japanese battleship, chaos erupted. Bulkheads screamed under pressure. Steam roared through ruptured pipes. Blood pooled on steel floors. A bridge officer shouted, "American battleship, bearing 044. Another cried, "We cannot find her silhouette." "She is invisible," a petty officer screamed. But Washington was not invisible. She was inevitable. 23:38 hours, the killing blows. Inside Washington's CIC, Hooper barked. Target turning, fires amidships, steering compromised. Lee replied, "Keep hitting her." Washington's gunners obeyed without hesitation. Turret 1 boomed again. Turret 2 answered. Turret 3 roared like thunder. Each impact tore Kirishima open. Each minute brought her closer to death. 23:43 hours, silence on the Japanese bridge. Kirishima's captain stared at flames engulfing the deck. "Hard to port," he yelled. Nothing happened. His ship no longer obeyed. He whispered an apology to his crew. And to Japan. 23:47 hours, Washington ceases fire. Hooper's voice came over the line. Steady but solemn. Target falling out of formation. Listing heavily. Fires uncontrolled. She's finished. Lee nodded. Hold fire. Let the sea take her. 0:03 hours, Iron Bottom Sound claims another. Kirishima rolled slowly, bow rising, stern sinking. Men leapt from the rails. Some swam. Some prayed. Most never reached daylight. The battleship slid beneath the waves, swallowed by the graveyard of fleets. Her death marked the end of Japan's dominance in night combat, and the beginning of radar supremacy. As Washington turned away into the night, Admiral Lee finally allowed himself a breath. "Message to all hands," he said, "well done." For the first time in the Pacific War, an American battleship had defeated a Japanese battleship in a fair fight. Except it had not been fair. Because for the first time, the Americans could see in the dark. November 15, 1942, 2:15 hours, Iron Bottom Sound. The battle was over, but the sea had not yet calmed. A faint orange glow lingered where Japanese ships burned on the horizon. Their flames reflected in the dark Pacific like distant funeral pyres. Smoke rolled low over the water, mingling with early morning mist that clung to the waves. Aboard USS Washington, the adrenaline drained away, replaced by something quieter, disbelief. 0 casualties. Not a single hit on the ship. And an entire Japanese bombardment force had been broken. Inside the gunnery control tower, Hooper finally exhaled, his hands trembling as he removed his headset. "Admiral," he whispered to Lee over the line, "we didn't miss, not once." Lee took a slow pull from his pipe. "That's because we stopped guessing," he said. "Tonight we let the radar think for us." 3 o'clock hours, securing the battle space. The sun had not risen, but the worst danger was already gone. Japanese destroyers had fled north, dragging damaged vessels away, trying to avoid American submarines prowling the depths. On Washington's decks, sailors moved quietly, hosing down spent brass casings and checking turret mechanisms. One sailor tapped a warm gun barrel. "First time she's fired in anger," he murmured. His chief grinned. "And she fired angry." 4:30 hours, a radio message from Guadalcanal. A crackling message came through from the Marines at Henderson Field. "To the battleships outside, thank you. The airfield still stands. You saved our boys." Captain Davis read it aloud to the bridge crew. Silence followed, heavy, emotional silence. A junior officer wiped his eyes discreetly. "We finally stopped them," he whispered. 6:45 hours, dawn breaks over Iron Bottom Sound. The sun rose slowly, its first rays revealing the grim aftermath. Oil slicks stretching miles. Severed masts. Floating debris. Lifeboats overturned. Burning wreckage drifting silently like ghosts. Washington cut through the debris with slow, steady dignity. Lookouts scanned the water. Some saluted quietly when they spotted the hull of a sunken American destroyer, another victim of the night's earlier fighting. The sea was a graveyard. And Washington was the lone survivor among giants. 7:15 hours, the unseen enemy. A messenger approached Admiral Lee. "Sir, message from headquarters. They're asking for damage reports." Lee smirked humorlessly. "Tell them, no damage." The messenger nodded, then hesitated. "Sir, they might not believe that." Lee's eyebrows lifted. "Then tell them again." Behind him, Captain Davis approached with another sheet of paper. "Admiral, they're asking how many enemy ships we claim sunk." Lee scanned the empty sky and the smoky horizon. "Tell them one battleship confirmed. Multiple cruisers and destroyers engaged. And tell them." He paused. "That radar made it possible." Davis nodded. But in Washington, D.C., admirals who still believed in optical gunnery would not be eager to hear that. 9:20 hours, the price of truth. That afternoon, Washington received a coded message. Admiral King requests full battle report. Emphasis on accuracy of radar-directed fire. Lee understood immediately. Washington's victory, the most extraordinary gunnery achievement in U.S. Navy history, threatened egos in high places. He walked into his cabin and sat at his small wooden desk. He began writing. At 23:29 hours, SG radar provided stable tracking solution on enemy battleship. He described the firing sequences, distances, radar plots, impacts. And then he wrote the one sentence that would define the future of naval warfare. "Radar has rendered optical night fighting obsolete." He set his pen down. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from certainty. This report would ignite a war inside the Navy. But he had no intention of softening the truth. 11:50 hours, the Japanese retreat. Dozens of miles north, the remains of the Japanese task force limped away. A cruiser listed so heavily that sailors had to cling to railings to avoid sliding into the sea. 2 destroyers trailed black smoke, their engines wheezing. Survivors overheard officers whispering, "Who hit us? How did they see us?" No ship could fire so accurately in darkness. A wounded petty officer shook his head. "It wasn't one ship," he said. "It was something we couldn't see." He had no word for radar. 16:10 hours, Henderson Field rises again. As the sun dipped low, Admiral Lee watched American aircraft take off from Henderson Field once more, Wildcats. Dauntlesses, Avengers, their engines roared triumphantly. A Marine colonel saluted Lee from the runway as his plane lifted off. Thanks to Washington, the Japanese would never again bombard the airfield at night. The tide had turned. 18:30 hours, in the wardroom. The officers gathered over coffee and stale biscuits. Someone finally broke the silence. "We made history last night." Hooper replied. "No, Admiral Lee did, we just followed the screens." Lee shook his head. "History isn't made by machines. It's made by men willing to trust them." He lifted his cup. "To Washington." The officers repeated the toast softly. "To Washington." 20:50 hours, a lonely triumph. Late that night, Lee stood alone on the starboard bridge wing. The sea sparkled faintly under starlight. Washington's hull cut through the water silently, proudly, like a champion returning home after a fight nobody believed she could win. Lee whispered into the warm wind. "They'll never understand how close we came to losing everything." He glanced toward Henderson Field, a faint glow on the horizon. "Not tonight," he said, "not on my watch." November 18, 1942, Noumea, New Caledonia, 14:10 hours. 3 days after the most decisive surface action in American naval history. Admiral Willis Lee stepped onto the pier at Noumea as sailors lined the railings of USS Washington in quiet pride. The battleship still gleamed with fresh paint. Her guns were clean, her hull bore no scars. But Lee's face was serious. He carried with him a thick leather-bound folder, Washington's official battle report, a document that would ignite controversy all the way to Washington, D.C. As he walked toward the naval headquarters, a group of junior officers murmured as he passed. "That's the man who killed Kirishima. No hits on his ship, none. How in God's name did he do it?" "Radar, that's the rumor." Lee pretended not to hear them. But he did. He always did. Inside the Noumea Operations Building. The room was hot, humid, and crowded with officers from the South Pacific Command. A tired ceiling fan stirred the stale air in lazy circles. Admiral William Halsey himself sat behind a cluttered desk, eyes sharp beneath his cap. Lee saluted. Halsey returned the gesture, then pointed at a chair. "Sit, Ching, tell me how the hell you pulled this miracle off." Lee placed the battle report on Halsey's desk. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly. Radar made it possible, sir. We tracked Kirishima from 22,000 yards. Fired without ever seeing her silhouette. Halsey leaned back, eyebrows raised. You're telling me you sank a Japanese battleship, without visual? Yes, sir. Halsey whistled low. Christ, some of the brass back home aren't going to like this. Lee nodded. I imagine they won't. The resistance begins. Hours later, encrypted messages began flowing across the Pacific. Some officers applauded the victory. Others questioned it. One admiral wrote, "Impossible to achieve such accuracy with radar alone." Another, "Over-reliance on new technology is dangerous and untested." A third, "Lee's methods break with established doctrine. Recommend caution." Lee read the replies without comment. Behind him, Hooper muttered angrily. They weren't there, they didn't see what we saw. Lee closed the folder. They'll come around, eventually. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Pearl Harbor, Navy Department Conference Room. November 27, 1942 ***. The Hawaiian morning sun streamed through tall windows as admirals crowded around a long table. Maps, charts, and radar schematics lay scattered across the polished wood. At the far end of the room sat Admiral Chester Nimitz, hands folded. A commander read aloud from Lee's report. The SG radar tracked enemy battleship consistently. Fire was opened at 23:29 hours using radar-only solution. 41 hits assessed on enemy vessel. Casualties, none. Something like disbelief rippled through the room. Admiral Pye frowned. No visibility at all? None, sir, the commander answered. Admiral Turner shook his head. Lee is rewriting naval warfare whether he knows it or not. Another admiral muttered. Or whether we want him to or not. Nimitz held up a hand. Gentlemen, we won. Henderson Field still stands. If radar won the night, then radar will win the next one too. Silence. Nimitz looked around the table. Let's not fight the future. Meanwhile, Tokyo Naval Staff College. December 1942 ***. A Japanese intelligence officer laid a chart on the table. Senior commanders leaned in. This is impossible, one captain snapped. One American battleship could not sink Kirishima alone. The officer swallowed. Sir, we believe the Americans used some new detection device. It can track ships in darkness. A vice admiral glared at him. Nonsense. No machine can replace the eyes of a trained officer. The intelligence officer hesitated, then whispered. Sir, we must consider the possibility that they have invented one. The vice admiral slammed his fist. We will not adjust tactics based on fantasies. Dismissed. And with that, the Japanese Navy sealed its fate. Just as the Luftwaffe had done months earlier. Just as the German High Command had done before Stalingrad. Denial was becoming a global disease. January 1943, aboard USS Washington. Pacific High Seas The winter swells rolled beneath the battleship as she steamed through grey water. The ship moved with quiet confidence, a veteran now, no longer untested steel. In the gunnery tower, Hooper trained a group of new radar operators. See this, he said, tapping the glowing oscilloscope. This is your eyesight now. This is how we fight. One young sailor frowned. Doesn't feel right fighting without seeing the enemy. Hooper smiled faintly. You saw the ocean this morning, didn't you? Looked calm? But it hides monsters, storms, depths, wrecks. He tapped the screen again. Your eyes lie, radar doesn't. Outside, Washington's guns stared silently at the horizon, giants waiting for their next duel. February 1943, Washington becomes a legend. In Washington's mess hall, word spread from ship to ship across the Pacific. Washington saved the Marines. Washington fought alone. Washington can see in the dark. They say she only needed 15 minutes to kill a battleship. Admiral Lee is the future. Sailors carved the ship's name into bulkheads, into scrap metal, into wooden crates. The myth had begun. And yet, in official communiques, Washington's victory was barely mentioned. A footnote. A line. An asterisk in the shadow of bigger headlines. Hooper slammed a newspaper on the table. They printed more about a supply convoy than about us. Lee glanced at the paper, then shrugged. History remembers what it wants. Let it take its time. But even he felt the sting. His crew had performed the greatest radar gunnery action in history, and the world barely knew it. March 1943, Washington's quiet burden. As the ship prepared for her next deployment, Lee stood alone on the forecastle, hands in his coat pockets. The wind whipped across the deck. The smell of salt and steel filled the air. Captain Davis approached slowly. "Hard to believe," he said, "that the night of a lifetime could be forgotten so easily." Lee turned toward him. "It won't be forgotten." He looked out over the Pacific. "It just hasn't been understood yet." May 3, 1943, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 9:40 hours. Sunlight spilled across Battleship Row, glinting off gray hulls and cranes as repair crews bustled along the piers. The Pacific Fleet had changed, new ships arriving monthly, old ships rising from the mud of December 7. But inside a conference room deep within the Navy Yard, it felt like 1925 again. Rear Admiral Willis, Ching, Lee stood before a semicircle of admirals, commanders, and technical officers. Blueprints of radar arrays and firing control towers lay spread across a polished mahogany table. The meeting was supposed to be routine. It was not. A skeptical voice broke the silence. "So, Admiral Lee, you're asking us to restructure gunnery doctrine around electronics?" Lee kept his tone even. "Not just electronics. SG radar is a revolution. Washington's success proved that." Another admiral scoffed. "Success? You mean that lucky skirmish at Guadalcanal?" Lee stiffened. "There was nothing lucky about it. We engaged a battleship in total darkness and destroyed her with 0 casualties." A murmur swept the room. The senior admiral leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Admiral Lee, the Navy has a century of tradition. You're asking us to replace the Mark I human eyeball with a glowing tube." Lee's voice sharpened slightly. "With respect, sir, the Mark I eyeball cannot see through darkness, smoke, or storms. Radar can." A tense pause. One captain whispered to another, "He wants to change everything." Lee heard that too. He always did. The backlash grows. Rumors traveled faster than ships. At Bremerton. At Mare Island. At Philadelphia. The same whispers spread through wardrooms. Lee is obsessed with radar. He's trying to kill the old ways. You can't trust a scope over a man's judgment. This isn't seamanship, it's mathematics. At sea, officers were divided. Younger lieutenants embraced technology. Older captains resisted it fiercely. Lee understood the tension, but he also understood something else. War didn't care about tradition. June 1943, aboard USS Washington. Mid-Pacific ***. On a quiet evening, the crew gathered along the decks, staring out at the horizon. Washington was weeks into another long patrol. Hooper arrived at the radar shack with a tray of coffee mugs. Inside, a new operator asked, "Sir, why doesn't the Navy want radar to lead?" Hooper sat, rubbed his tired eyes. "Because it makes some people obsolete." He pointed at the dim orange glow of the radar screen. "This thing doesn't salute. It doesn't worry about rank. It just tells the truth." The operator nodded slowly. "Truth doesn't always win in the Navy." Hooper sighed. "No, but in battle, it always wins." Washington's growing reputation. Across the Pacific, sailors of every ship knew the legend. Washington, the ship that kills in the dark. Marines at Guadalcanal carved its silhouette on crates. Submarine crews toasted it during rare moments of calm. Aviation crews called it "Ghost Killer" for its invisible attack. And Japanese intelligence analysts, secretly terrified, had given Washington a name of their own. The Blind Warrior. Because she could see without light. But none of this changed how slowly the Navy moved. Doctrine committees stalled. Senators questioned funding. Traditionalists pushed back. Lee was winning battles on the water, but losing battles in the halls of power. August 1943, the report that broke the Bureau. Washington steamed into Espiritu Santo for refit. Lee flew to Pearl Harbor for a scheduled strategy session. He arrived with a new report, a brutal, honest assessment. In it, he wrote, "Future naval combat will be decided by those who can see first, shoot first, and hit first, regardless of daylight." Victory at Guadalcanal was not luck. It was the beginning of modern naval warfare. The fleet must adapt or perish. When the report reached Washington, D.C., one admiral slammed it shut. "Lee is trying to replace naval instinct with electronic toys." Another added, "We built these ships to fight like men, not machines." But Nimitz supported Lee. In a quiet memo, he wrote, "Wars are not won by nostalgia." Still, change moved slowly. Too slowly. October 1943, Washington prepares for the next war. On the deck of USS Washington, sailors repainted turrets as rain clouds drifted across the blue-gray Pacific. Lee stood with Captain Davis, scanning the horizon. Davis spoke first. "We proved what radar can do. Why are we fighting our own navy to prove it again?" Lee folded his hands behind his back. "New ideas make enemies, Captain. Old ideas make casualties." Davis looked at him. "You really believe radar will define the next war?" Lee didn't hesitate. "I think it already has." At that moment, the distant thrum of carrier aircraft drifted over the sea. The war was far from over. And Washington, still undefeated, still unscarred, would soon be tested again. More battles waited. More nights. More storms. But the real storm was brewing not on the water, but in the minds of the men who refused to accept what Washington had proven beyond doubt. November 1, 1943, North Pacific. En route to the Central Solomons. 3:12 hours. The sea was black glass under a moonless sky. USS Washington cut through the swells like a silent predator. Radar antennas rotating steadily as wind howled across the main deck. Inside Combat Information Center, CIC, the room glowed with the dim amber light of radar screens. Sailors hunched over scopes, headphones pressed to their ears. A sudden chirp. Then another. The operator stiffened. "Contact. Bearing 270, range 22 miles, multiple returns." Hooper leaned over his shoulder. "Surface or air?" "Surface, sir. Large contacts. Moving fast." Hooper keyed his mic. "Bridge, Hooper. CIC reports unidentified surface group, closing." Above, on the bridge, Captain Davis stepped forward, binoculars in hand. But he saw nothing. Just blackness. He muttered, "Damn it, radar again." The old problem. Convincing the Navy to trust the screen before trusting their eyes. The Japanese strike force moves in. At that same moment, 22 miles away, Admiral Sentaro Omori stood on the bridge of cruiser Myoko, sea spray whipping his face. His task force, cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports, pushed through the darkness toward Empress Augusta Bay. Their objective: destroy American transports before dawn, retake Bougainville, reverse the Solomons campaign. Omori had every advantage the Japanese believed mattered. Night-trained crews. Flare-launching cruisers. Powerful torpedoes. Speed. What he didn't know. Washington saw him clearly. He saw nothing. CIC comes alive. Radar operator. Range 20 miles and closing. Multiple heavy ships, looks like cruisers. Hooper turned to Captain Davis. "We've got a perfect track on them. Recommend turning south to intercept." Davis hesitated. The old doctrine said, "Never maneuver based solely on radar." But the new doctrine, Lee's doctrine, said the opposite. Davis exhaled. "Helm, come to course 180. All ahead full." Washington heeled slightly as her massive hull carved through the waves. Hooper radioed AFT. "Ching Lee, sir, enemy fleet dead ahead." From deep inside the flag plot, Rear Admiral Willis, Ching Lee adjusted his glasses and spoke calmly. "Very well, let's go hunt them." The previous battles echo in the darkness. Sailors whispered at their stations. "Is this like Guadalcanal? Are they sending another battleship?" "Washington's got this, she never misses." Hooper stood behind the plotting table, pencil in hand. This wasn't Guadalcanal. This was trickier, more chaotic, more moving parts, more ships converging. The Japanese formation maneuvered erratically, confused by poor visibility. Washington had clarity. But she didn't have perfect data. Every ship in the task force reported something different. Because none of them had radar as powerful as Washington's. Lee held firm. "Plot Washington's track first, everyone else can adjust to us." Davis nodded. "Yes, sir." The first sight of the enemy. At 4:10, the sea suddenly lit with distant flashes. Gunfire. Japanese cruisers were firing, blindly, at what they thought were American destroyers. Hooper shouted, "They're firing at shadows, they haven't seen us." Lee smiled slightly. "And they won't. Not until it's too late." He checked the firing solution being drawn on the table. "Prepare main battery, stand by for radar-directed salvo." Sailors gripped their headphones tighter. The echo of Guadalcanal hung in the air. One officer whispered, "Here we go again, Washington leading the dark." A battle almost lost to bureaucracy. Just as the firing sequence neared readiness, a frantic radio came from the cruiser Montpellier. "Enemy possibly retreating, request permission to pursue independently." Lee bristled. "Negative, maintain formation." But the screen crackled as multiple captains began tripping over each other with conflicting orders. Old doctrine. Old habits. Old fear of radar. Davis turned to Lee. They don't trust our track. Lee slammed his fist lightly against the chart table. Because they're still fighting by moonlight. A crucial moment. At 4:22, Hooper pointed to the screen. Admiral, enemy cruisers are reversing course, they're retreating. Washington had done nothing yet. No shots fired. Just pressure. Lee muttered. They think we're the whole damn fleet. And in a sense, Washington was. Omori, blinded by dark seas and confused reports, believed he faced 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, multiple destroyers, carrier aircraft inbound. None of it was true. Washington alone had deceived him. The Japanese task force turned north, withdrawing without realizing Washington was just one ship. Hooper watched the screen as the blips faded. That's it, they're gone. Davis lowered his binoculars. We scared off an entire fleet, without firing a shot. Lee nodded. Good. But don't mistake this for victory. He faced the bridge windows, where dawn was breaking over the waves. They will learn. They will adapt. And next time, they won't run a beat. And we'll need more than one Washington. Aftermath, silence on the bridge. The Pacific sun was rising, coloring the sea in silver streaks. Sailors relaxed for the first time in hours. Radar operators rubbed their exhausted eyes. Gunnery crews powered down the turrets. The long night ended quietly. But inside Lee's mind, a storm was gathering. Washington had just won another battle. With radar, with deception, with precision. And once again, the Navy would question it. He knew the arguments waiting in Pearl Harbor. You should have closed for visual confirmation. You should have used flares. You relied too much on radar. You were too cautious. You were too aggressive. He removed his glasses and whispered. We need a fleet that understands what this ship already knows. Hooper heard him. And if they don't listen? Lee answered without looking away from the sea. Then we'll win the war despite them. December 17, 1944, somewhere east of the Philippines. 2:40 hours. The sea was a monster. Waves rose like black cliffs, slamming against USS Washington with the weight of mountains. Typhoon Cobra, one of the deadliest natural disasters in naval history, had swallowed the Third Fleet whole. Rain lashed the steel decks in horizontal sheets. The wind shrieked like it wanted to tear the antennas from the mast. The sea boiled under the ship, throwing Washington upward and dropping her into troughs so deep sailors swore the ship would snap in half. Inside the bridge, sailors clung to anything that didn't move. Some prayed. Some cursed. Some simply stared at the raging ocean, unable to speak. Captain Davis stood braced against the helm console, rainwater dripping from his cap brim. Helm, keep her bow into the waves. The helmsman shouted back. Aye, sir, trying, but barely succeeding. Washington weighed 35.000 tons, yet the typhoon tossed her like a toy. Nearby, a destroyer nearly rolled over. Another disappeared entirely in a wall of water. The storm was killing ships faster than the Japanese ever had. CIC goes blind. In the Combat Information Center, radar screens flickered and died one by one. Hooper slapped the side of a failing scope. Come on, hold together. Nothing. Static. The storm made radar useless. For the first time since Guadalcanal, Washington fought blind. A junior sailor clutched the counter as the ship rolled hard to port. Sir, if we lose steering. We won't, Hooper snapped. Hold the line. But even he wasn't sure. The typhoon's fury. Washington climbed another monstrous wave. Her bow lifted, higher, then slammed down with such force sailors were thrown off their feet. Steel groaned, rivets shrieked, one turret motor overloaded from seawater flooding the casing. On the flight deck of cruiser Monterey, aircraft were breaking loose, exploding into fireballs. Even Admiral Halsey's flagship was in chaos. But Washington endured. A wave smashed over the forward deck, burying the first turret. Saltwater cascaded down the superstructure. Captain Davis shouted, "Secure all hatches, keep compartments sealed." Sailors scrambled across the tilting deck, clipping onto safety lines as the wind tried to hurl them overboard. One man slipped. Another grabbed his collar, just in time. The ocean took 2 others that night. Lee keeps the fleet alive. Admiral Willis, Ching, Lee wasn't on board Washington anymore, He'd been shifted to Battleship Division 9 months earlier, but his doctrine kept her alive. Every order Davis shouted echoed Lee's philosophy. Trust the instruments. Respect the sea. Never fight the weather like you fight the enemy. Crewmen clung to memories of Lee's calm voice from earlier battles. The ocean is our first enemy. The Japanese are second. Tonight, the enemy was winning. Dawn breaks on destruction. December 18th, 6:10 hours. The storm began to weaken. Not end, just loosen its claws. The horizon brightened into a metallic gray. Rain softened into a mist. Washington steadied. Her decks were mangled, guns drenched, antennas bent, but she still moved with purpose. She still lived. But around her, devastation. Hooper stepped out onto the bridge wing, looking into the morning haze. Dear God! Ships floated capsized. Destroyers drifted without power. One carrier burned from stem to stern. Bodies and debris drifted through the foam. 3 American destroyers were gone. More than 790 sailors dead. 146 aircraft destroyed by weather alone. It was the greatest non-combat loss in U.S. naval history. Captain Davis shook his head slowly. Mother Nature, she doesn't take sides. A signalman approached, voice shaking. Sir, Washington reports 0 combat casualties. Engineering intact, turrets functional, radar down but repairable. Davis exhaled, stunned. 0 casualties, again. Washington had survived battleships, cruisers, torpedoes, shore guns. And now, a typhoon that killed more Americans than many major naval battles. She was charmed. Or cursed. Or simply that good. Halsey sends a message. Hours later, a battered signal was received from Admiral Halsey. Battleships Washington, North Carolina, and Indiana, report status. Fleet reorganization underway. Prioritize safety. Washington's reply was simple. Washington operational, ready for tasking. Hooper folded the message and smirked. She's indestructible. Davis replied. No. Just prepared. Lee reflects from afar. Aboard the command ship New Jersey, Admiral Lee read the fleet's casualty report. He removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. He whispered. Radar didn't save them this time, seamanship did. His aide leaned in. Sir? Lee nodded toward the ocean. That battleship, Washington, she's the future. Not because she's strong. Because her crew trusts in discipline more than superstition. Washington steams toward her final campaign. By the evening of December 19th, Washington was already pushing east, heading for repairs and resupply. Her hull bore new scars. The paint was torn, antennas twisted. But her engines throbbed confidently, pushing her through the fading storm. On the fantail, a machinist leaned on the railing, watching the sun break through clouds like molten silver. We survive everything, he murmured. Another sailor replied quietly. Yeah. But one day, the Navy's gonna bury this ship in reports, not the sea. He wasn't wrong. Washington would soon become part of the most complex amphibious operations of the Pacific War, but her greatest battles were already behind her. And no one in Navy leadership fully understood what they owed her. Not yet.